My name is Dan Berkman, and I am with FEMA's National Integration Center. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak at this conference. And prior to where I am right now, I was with FEMA's Recovery Interagency Coordination Division, and then Montgomery County, Maryland's Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. So I come from a local emergency management background, and it took me a couple of steps, but finally got to a place at FEMA that supports and wants to interact with the state, local, tribal, territorial governments. Sometimes, and I've heard it in a couple speeches so far the last couple of days. FEMA does have a certain reputation. We can look internally, so happy to be external working with you. I really enjoy these talks and look forward to building further relationships with you as well. It's honestly my favorite part of the job, and I'll definitely leave time at the end of my talk for discussion and questions. But my start in emergency management really has roots in Vermont itself. I went to camp growing up near Plymouth, Vermont. I then studied geology and geography at Middlebury College, and ever since then, I try to get back to the state at least once a year. I would have come to this, unfortunately, due to a family emergency. I couldn't come up from DC for this, but again, future times, looking forward to interacting with anyone in the room or online down the road. My wife and I talk about moving up there eventually ourselves. But back to emergency management. While in grad school, I have family friends that live on North Hero, and you can see on the left-hand side the sunset picture overlooking the Adirondacks. So when I was in grad school, I ended up writing a paper based on their stories about the 1998 ice storm that many might remember themselves living through. So I really enjoyed writing about how the community was able to support each other, and when the National Guard came in a few days after the causeway was cleared, the story I heard and confirmed with the story, the townspeople told the National Guard what to do instead of the other way around. So my base in emergency management is really about those community relationships and that being the backbone to resiliency. I remember the town manager telling me, I'm glad this event didn't happen in the summertime, or a different event happened in the summertime when more people come in and don't know each other as well. So this is my paper. It's definitely not a FEMA document. I'm happy to share this with anyone that's interested. No guarantees on the writing from 12 years ago, but I know it reads a little more like an oral history of the event rather than a technical grad paper. So there'll be things that I can share down the road. So again, as my email comes up on the last slide, let me know which of the things you might want, including the PowerPoint itself. So now that I'm at FEMA, I try to stay connected with states and locals and tribal territorial governments. And my team works on preparedness guidance found, you can see on the slide, basically FEMA.gov/plan. It's at the state and local level where a lot of the preparedness, response, and recovery really takes place. So I'm going to start with the other guides from the title, and then I'll get into the climate guide. But these guides are really best practices, lessons learned from you and your colleagues, and build off interactions like these. So I'm going to ask a question for the room and those folks online. You see Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 101 or CPG 101. I'm just going to ask you to hit the like button or raise your hand in the room if you're familiar with this CPG 101. And then Emily, I might have you give me a quasi head count if possible. And no worries if you aren't familiar with it, but I'll have a follow-up to that.
Okay, so in the room we've got 8 out of 24.
All right. Thanks everyone, and for your honesty too. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do with it, and then I want to mention someone in the room that can actually help you out as well. So this is our flagship document. It follows let me do one more click, the 6-step planning process. For CBG 101, it really focuses on the emergency operations plan, so a little more response focused of getting a team together, what's the situation, determining those goals and objectives, developing the plan, reviewing and publishing the plan, but really then keeping it updated as well. It's one of our foundational planning documents, but knowing the numbers in the room and online, don't worry about it. Brian, if you're in the room, raise your hand if you can. He's our FEMA FIT member, and he offers CBG 101 and FOPM training to Vermont agencies and locals. Brian, if you want to take 30 seconds and introduce yourself and what you have to offer, people can find you afterwards too.
Can you hear me?
He can.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm part of the FEMA integration team, so I'm embedded up here with Vermont Emergency Management full-time. My background with FEMA is in operational planning. I helped write some of the doctrine a dozen years ago on the six-step planning process and how FEMA applies it to write our all-hazard plans and incident annexes. I recently came out a couple months ago to the Vermont Department of Health and provided a one-day training, and I'd be happy to do the same for any of you who see me after the session if you want more information.
Thanks, Brian. He texted me right before that he saw the slide and can offer. So we call this being FEMA flexible of, things come up and you want to be able to adapt quickly. So if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to Brian afterwards. So as I said, CBG 101 is our flagship one. And then on this slide, you'll see examples of guides we've put out specifically for emergency managers, but other stakeholders as well. So that top left guide, our most recent guide, is the local elected and appointed officials guide from September 2022. This was the last one I worked on in depth. It's kind of an emergency management 101 for elected and appointed officials. So instead of the 5 mission areas or the 6-step planning process we talk about before, during, and after a disaster. So some guides geared towards specific stakeholders, the second one being that building private-public partnerships guide. So I saw the Green Mountain Power talk yesterday as a good example of making those relationships between utility companies and state local governments. The other one I really like to point out is the Disaster Financial Management Guide. Again, coming from a local perspective, I used to view FEMA in the Jerry Maguire essence of show me the money, I'll do what you want, just let me get the money. So this is a good walkthrough of where not only FEMA dollars, but other federal dollars may come from before an event, if you can plan before, or unlocked funding if an event like the July flooding might occur. So highly recommend that one as well. Notice it has an April 2020 date on it. I'll put a link at the end. There's also an online recovery and resilience resource library that you can kind of search for specific funding types, or if you're a certain type of jurisdiction, what type of funding you might look for. So it's filterable and then shows that funding. That's what I worked on before in the recovery realm. So finding that money, I know is an important from that from your state and local perspective. So feel free to go to FEMA.gov/plan. While I'm talking, I don't mind. If there's specific guides you have follow-up questions for, reach out. So some of these guides, like the climate guide I'll discuss, do follow the 6-step planning process that's from CBG 101. So the supply chain or healthcare facilities are 2 examples of that. So some guides are specific to stakeholders and some for emergency managers following that 6-step planning process. So with that, I'll start to talk a little more about the climate guide I'm working on right now. So why is this important? 1, it's an urgent issue we face together. 2, the number and cost of disasters associated with climate change is increasing, as seen on that decadal time graphic at the right-hand side. And then just thinking about what Vermont experienced in July, followed by the Hawaii wildfires, followed by preparations for Hurricane Lee and just the fall hurricane season. It is kind of a year-round dealing with various disasters, especially from the federal perspective, but it also takes a toll locally and statewide as you're recovering and then another event might hit. So it's really important and it's costing more money. So, and then the last thing is FEMA sets out a 5-year strategic plan every 5 years. So this is one of 3 main strategic goals for FEMA, along with equity and workforce development. Not to say that the FEMA strategic plan is what you follow yourselves, but it gives our agency a lane to work on this issue. So with that said, the strategic plan, a lot has come out on climate already from FEMA. I'm well aware of that. I can walk you through these in chronological order. And again, with the links, I can share the slide deck at the end. So the first one from December 2021, just a list of resources at FEMA that deal with climate resiliency. Admittedly, this is more like an annotated bibliography of, it doesn't read like a story, it's just kind of a list of things. The second thing that came out was the long-term community resilience exercise resource guide, which is a great guide, but obviously a little more geared toward building like a tabletop exercise with climate components within that exercise. The two links there, one goes to the FEMA Prep Toolkit, which takes a couple extra steps to get to the actual PDF, but then the second link is through a different website that goes directly to the PDF. And then there have been nature-based solution guides that also come out that if you're thinking about how to improve mitigation through nature-based solutions, those guides exist. And then there's a website with updated fact sheets, press releases as more funding gets rolled out, especially from the Inflation Reduction Act and Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, that those, as they get down to state and local level, get described a little more in depth as well. And I started doing these talks starting in the summer, and then there were even more things that got released. So, and I actually helped work on these guides as well. So that first one that came out in July, they both came out in July, but the Response and Recovery Climate Change Planning Guidance, admittedly, and it says on the second page, is for FEMA planners internally, but they made it public, which is great, to kind of walk through response and recovery planning in a climate realm, and does touch on lifelines, recovery support functions, and considerations broken down in those levels. The guide on the right, Climate Essentials for Emergency Managers, is a very high-level guide. I'd say 25 to 30 pages, just hitting some highlights of, as an emergency manager, what do you need to know about climate? And within the last week or two, even a 4-page elected official guide of what they would need to know about extreme temperature came out, and I know they're kind of doing a series of specific events, heat, cold, for example, not just extreme temperatures. So there might be more of those forthcoming too. And I list all these for reference, but also I can imagine from someone in the room or online, all right, there are a lot of these guides. It kind of feels like the Spider-Man meme of which one should I go to and why. A few of them are overlapping. Admittedly, that's on purpose. So they all have different audiences, some internal to FEMA, some external to FEMA. And depending on your position, you might get access to one and then reference another. So all that is okay and on purpose. And again, following the CBG 101 6-step planning process, the guide we're developing in my shop follows something emergency managers might be familiar with, but also connects to all these guides too that have already been published if you want that in more information. So next few slides, I'll discuss the current draft of the climate adaptation planning for emergency managers. Given the Spider-Man meme and keeping with pop culture references, any Lord of the Rings fans out there, I jokingly say this is the one guide to rule them all and in the darkness bind them. But seriously, as I just said, following Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 101, this guide is to help emergency managers incorporate climate adaptation into current emergency planning efforts. So it could be your hazard mitigation plan, it could be emergency operation plan. Whatever plan is to give you enough ideas to incorporate climate into other documents or make your own climate guide, adaptation planning guide itself. So a couple of examples, it informs emergency managers of ways to incorporate climate change into risk assessments, future planning, and then resource considerations. It also directs planners to resources and decision support tools. I'll touch on that in a second. So instead of here's 1, 2, 3, 4, we kind of made a grid of here's like 10 or 12 federal tools that all kind of do something similar, something different. From your perspective, I want something easy to use, something that looks for rural populations, something that considers social equity or social vulnerability. So we kind of made a table of looking at what tools focus on what areas. And then lastly, we try to highlight case studies, innovative practices is what it says on the slide. So what makes this guide different than the other guides that I just displayed? It's talks like this that we're going to get your feedback either verbally here, which is great, or I'll send you the draft once we're done if you're interested. So we're about to start our national engagement period. So I'll send this around. We're always looking for real world case studies if you're interested in sharing. I might say that one or two more times as well, but really getting the feedback back from you is what has made our documents pretty strong, in my opinion, rather than just being pushed out without that state and local perspective. Oh, I chose my Vermont mug from the Warren store, which is one of my go-tos when I am in the state as well. So quick overview of the guide. Here are 5 main sections. Section 1 highlights key terms and differences between climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and hazard mitigation. Section 2 provides an overview of climate science and regional impacts and potential tools for climate modeling, which I mentioned before. And then Section 3 presents an overview of climate adaptation planning, with Section 4 following that 6-step planning process and explains the information and actions for each step. Kind of in summary, Section 2 can be read as reference material, building climate literacy, like that figure at the right, showing different climate impacts on different geographic regions in the U.S., where Sections 3 and 4 are potential actions emergency managers can take around climate adaptation planning, along with those case studies for reference. So, like the elected official guide, try to keep it high level, or not high level, but I think that's possible, but with links and opportunities to go to other resources if you're interested in learning more about the source material of where we got that from. So a little more on Section 2. Don't worry about the writing on the right-hand side. It's more an illustrated example. But the first few bullets on the slide point to the science behind how we know climate is changing and the impacts on the natural environment, especially at the regional level, as shown on the last slide. And it also talks through some key terminology. So representative concentration pathways, RCPs, for the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, as seen in that chart on the right-hand side. That terminology and thinking about those longer-term timescales is relevant for emergency managers when looking at some of those potential climate modeling tools, because they talk about, do you want less concentration carbon, more concentration carbon? Do you want a 2050 timeframe or a 2100 timeframe? So it is thinking ahead in those examples. And then we get into how those might impact people and the economy and what emergency managers can do about it. So for example, we currently model for hurricanes days in advance, as I'm sure you just went through with Hurricane or Tropical Storm Lee once it got closer to New England. Thinking about response logistics. So from a climate adaptation planning perspective, what modeling or preparation can you do years or decades in advance? Which kind of leads to that second to last bullet on using those climate modeling tools to then be able to figure out where that might be within your jurisdiction or a geographic area. I highlight the Climber tool, Climber for short, which can get very specific, super detailed geographies. And as I mentioned, it's one of many tools that you might want to use depending on what you're looking for. And lastly, we have a subsection on communicating climate change to the public. That's the example call-out box on the bottom right. It's an example of, at the end of each section, we do have key takeaways. Documents can be long, you're busy lives, so I just want to get what are the top 5 to 10, really 4 to 5 or 6 things from this section that I should take away. And so this is an example of if I'm talking to the public, what are the key things to keep in mind? And then Section 3 is a broad overview of climate adaptation planning, and their forming main principles, focus on the future, linked to community and planning processes, and then leveraging partnerships and relationships, and lastly, using a multidisciplinary approach. A good example, the last sub-bullet is, as I mentioned before, nature-based solutions, where I showed you the guides earlier that are FEMA guides. We'll show this picture. You're like, that's interesting. And then we'll have a link to that other nature-based solution guide if you want to learn more specifics there. So kind of, we have to use common denominator. This is going to the whole nation. But we are trying to hit from rural to urban populations, mountainous to water geographies. So hopefully enough things, and when I've given other talks to other state conferences, it gives them ideas of, oh, in my jurisdiction, I need to be aware of if they build a new parking lot, what do we do with the old concrete? Is there anything in materials to be aware of that is going to have a climate impact? So hopefully this is stirring up some thoughts for yourself of what you would want to do. And as you read the guide, that's the direction we want to go. And then lastly, again, the show me the money. We start to highlight potential funding sources for adaptation solutions, and there's a longer appendix as well describing more solutions. So good examples here that we highlight: the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC grants, and flood mitigation assistance as two of the main ones off the bat. Excuse me. And then, as I said, section 4 goes much more in depth for each step of the 6-step planning process in regards to climate adaptation planning. At the end of each section are these green boxes, call-out boxes for the key takeaways, similar to what I said with communicating climate change, but these are specific to the 6-step planning process. And again, each step we try to highlight a case study. And admittedly, the current case studies that are in there are all open source examples. But if you have any from your communities you would like to share, please follow up with me after the conference, and we'd be happy to write it for you. Just another example of linking to other resources. In step 6, you see exercising the plan. So we have a call-out box to that climate resilience exercise guide. You know, if you want to learn more about writing a climate-focused exercise, that's where you go. So again, trying to move people in a direction that they might be interested in going, following the 6-step planning process. And then the appendices range in focus areas as well. The first one highlights how climate change is a risk multiplier, especially in terms of response and recovery operations. Multiple or cascading impacts or events may overlap and diminish available resources, extend timeline, and raise costs. So this appendix lists out what the emergency considerations are by lifelines and recovery support functions. Again, I mentioned that FEMA response planning guide. That's an example of where we're trying to say the same information to FEMA planners, but also state and local planners. And then, as mentioned earlier, the modeling tools was in a grid, but in the second appendix, it goes a little more in depth to explain some tools and what they could be used for. And then the third appendix is that financial appendix, which I have a whole different running list of what else would be interested for state and locals. So trying to keep it consolidated, but there are definitely cool and interesting things out there. And I offer that of, if you're aware of anything or using any grants, would love to make sure that's included as well. And then the last two appendices are glossary and an acronym list. So our current timeline, admittedly, the federal wheel of bureaucracy moves ever so slowly. No guarantees what's going to happen at the end of next week with the shutdown. Hopefully, no shutdown, but not saying that's the only thing. It's just there's an approval process that takes time. So we've been done with our main draft after an initial stakeholder review, and we're waiting for our leadership to say, yes, you can start the national engagement period, technically, which is a 30-day review window where we'll offer webinars kind of like this presentation. Admittedly, Emily and I connected after the elected official guide came out and made the Vermont connection. So thank you, Emily, for filling me in on this conference right now. But you see the green box for national engagement being late summer, early fall. I looked up the fall equinox, aka that split, is actually in a couple days. So I'm happy to say, even though we're not in our official 30-day window, I'm happy to share the current version of the guide with you and give you extra time if you need it. And then once we receive your feedback, others through the national engagement period will adjudicate all those comments, do document revision, go through the approval process again, and I'm hoping to get this published by early 2024. My personal gut tells me it's about 75, 80% complete, but totally open to your honest feedback. And again, that's what makes these guides that we try to produce strong by getting state and local tribe territorial perspectives. So we do have other guides that are in the final process and then still similar to national engagement development. So that first one, planning considerations for cyber incidents, it's in the final routing process. It should be released in a month or two. Final, we'll have webinars for that as well. If you're interested, let me know. I can make sure you're on the list of receiving that information. As I said, we have a climate guide. Equity was another strategic plan focus. So we have an equity guide that follows the 6-step planning process. It's a few weeks behind the climate guide, but that's going to be out for national engagement shortly. And then we're starting to update some of our existing guides. You'll see on the slide the faith-based and community organization guide. Excuse me. Disaster financial management, one on my internal list I would like to update with anything new. And so anything that you're interested in, either seeing updated or guides that we don't have that you think from a state, local perspective are important, this is where we like to have those interactions, and we can continue to build our library in that way. And just a reminder of our website at the bottom. So tried to aim for about 30 minutes and then for talking, but then I really did want to leave time for discussion and general questions as well. So I know it's a little bit harder with the virtual presentation, but open to any questions you have, specifically on this slide on the climate guide. Any general FEMA questions, happy to answer on the question slide. So I'll give you a couple minutes to think about a question, but a few prompts to consider from this slide. Given my initial overview, is there anything missing? I have a different running list of other potential things to include. Any other resources or tools out there? The Climate Resilience Toolkit by NOAA. I'm working closely with the person that developed that, so we have a call-out box for that. But any big resources that you think other jurisdictions would find useful or benefit from, we like that. As you can see, we're trying to do different call-out boxes or graphics to make it visually pleasing within the parameters of what FEMA External Affairs allows. And then the guide length right now, it's about 65, 70 pages. I know that feels like a lot, but we also will do micro learning. So with that elected official guide, we did a 4-page executive summary, a different set of checklists just to pull out so you can physically check off. There's a 7-minute YouTube video and a podcast. So if there's anything along those lines you find interesting, useful from your own work itself, that's what we're looking to do once it's published. So we're going off that material. So with that, I'll open it to any questions in the room or on Teams.
Great, thank you, Dan. So first, we do have a question in the room. Stephanie Smith, State Hazard Mitigation Officer.
Hi, thank you, Daniel. So obviously, as the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, a bit of a biased opinion here, but I have some incredibly intelligent counterparts across the country, and this is our lane in a way that I would encourage you to engage the SHMOs as a group in the review directly of this entity, of this product, because in Vermont, our state hazard mitigation plan is our climate adaptation plan for the state. We don't separate the two. We have a climate action plan as well. That's part of that angle, but that's really where, within a lot of states, that climate adaptation lives, is within the SHMOs, within the hazard mitigation program. And then the other thing that I would encourage you to think about, and I know this pushes out of your lane a bit, but with the development of this type of guide, how can we take what we're learning from this and what sort of things across the country we need to see in terms of climate adaptation and use that to push the hazard mitigation grant program, which is one of the best sources we have to implement this work, to be more inclusive of all of these adaptation strategies and helping us better fund those activities. So, thank you.
That's a great point, and those were admittedly behind the curtain discussions of how do we relate this to hazard mitigation planning, and thinking about across the nation how people's views of climate are. We didn't want to say, you know, this is just your hazard mitigation planning, just include climate in it, because some people might say we already do that, which is potentially true, but other people might want to put it off. So you make a really great point. If there is a state hazard mitigation officer forum to present either quarterly, I'm happy to give a similar talk during these next couple months as we're going through this longer national engagement period. So if you want to connect me with anyone on that front, happy to go to the broader state audience too.
Yeah, I would happily help you set that up. So thank you.
Cool.
Thank you. So for anyone else online, I am seeing a question in the chat that I'll have them verbalize momentarily. Anyone else online or in the room, please just raise your hand so I can call on you. So now we'll go to Rosie Kruger with her question.
Hey there. So this is feedback on the guides generally. So I started to look through some of them as you were speaking, and you're asking about resources that we notice are missing. So I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs here at the Agency of Education, and I'm seeing there's not a ton on the disaster feeding resources available from the USDA Food and Nutrition Service. Seeing a couple of references to DSNAP, but there are a lot of other resources. I'm going to talk about those for folks here at a session at 1:30. And then in the guide for local officials, again, just took a very quick glance through, but one thing we're thinking a lot about here at the agency is making sure that local officials are taking into consideration the really negative impacts of closing schools on children and their families when they're thinking about disaster response. And so would love to have that highlighted in that guide for local officials. So missing school meals is a pretty concrete example, but there's a lot of other support services aside from just learning loss of kids missing school. And my colleague Ted Fisher is going to talk about that in a session at the end of the conference today. So would love to see those things reflected. Again, not specifically about the climate guide, but the other guides.
No, that's a great point. And the DSNAP, I mean, more than DSNAP, but other USDA services is kind of on my running list. So I'll attend your talk at 1:30 for sure, and then also maybe follow up with you too of making sure the right resources, especially related to climate, are in our resource guide.